The air was crisp, with a faint chill of spring lingering as Cindy finished her shift at the local clinic. Life after her divorce had been far from easy, juggling a job, raising her son, and piecing together a semblance of normalcy. But then Randy entered her life like a breath of fresh air. Handsome, attentive, and seemingly stable, he had an uncanny ability to say just the right thing. It wasn't long before she began to believe that, maybe, happiness was possible again. Their relationship had progressed quickly, almost too quickly, but Randy always managed to smooth over any doubts. "We're meant to be together," he'd whisper, his voice dripping with reassurance. Cindy's friends noticed the speed at which he'd inserted himself into her life, but she waved off their concerns. Wasn't it time she allowed herself to be happy? Besides, Randy had a way of making her feel safe, or so she thought. Lisa, Cindy's closest confidant, wasn't so easily convinced. During a casual coffee date, Lisa leaned forward, her tone hushed but urgent. "Cindy, doesn't it seem fast? He's already talking about your future, and you've only known him for a few months." Cindy smiled, though a flicker of hesitation betrayed her confidence. "Randy's just prepared, you know? He likes to plan." Lisa didn't let it drop. "Prepared for what? Marriage? Insurance policies? Have you noticed how much he talks about security and money?" The words lingered, unspoken between them. Cindy looked away, the warmth of her coffee cup suddenly uncomfortable in her hands. Randy had indeed been discussing finances, a lot. He'd even suggested they look into a joint life insurance policy, just in case. But wasn't that what responsible couples did? Later that evening, Randy's charm worked its magic again. "Lisa's just protective, because she loves you," he said, his voice low and soothing. "I understand. But you and I, we have something real. She'll see that in time." Cindy nodded, comforted by his words, but unable to fully shake Lisa's caution. Yet Randy seemed so genuine, so present. How could she not trust him? Still, the seeds of doubt had been planted, and they began to grow when Cindy stumbled upon something peculiar. While tidying Randy's desk, she discovered a folder labeled Janice. Opening it, she found a collection of old photographs and documents related to his late wife. The name had come up once or twice in passing, but Randy had always been vague about her tragic death. The photos showed a smiling young woman, hiking through rugged terrain, until Cindy's eyes landed on a newspaper clipping. "Local woman falls to death at Beacon Rock." Her heart skipped. She quickly replaced the folder, her mind racing. When Randy arrived later that evening, Cindy hesitated, watching his every move. Should she ask him about it? Would he think she was prying? Randy noticed her unease and pulled her into a tight embrace. "What's on your mind, sweetheart?" "Nothing," she lied, her voice wavering. "Just a long day." But Cindy's long day turned into a restless night. The folder haunted her dreams, along with an unsettling thought. If Randy's first wife had died in an accident, why did the memories feel so curated? The next morning, Cindy woke to a bouquet of flowers waiting on the counter. A note read, "To my beautiful future wife, our best days are ahead." Randy's words felt like a balm, soothing the cracks of doubt that had begun to form. Maybe she was overthinking things. Maybe he truly was the devoted partner he claimed to be. Yet, the unease returned when Randy casually mentioned the life insurance policy again over dinner. "It's just smart," he insisted. "We'll be prepared for anything. It's about protecting each other, you and me." Cindy's stomach tightened. The idea made sense on the surface, but Lisa's words echoed in her mind. "Doesn't it seem fast?" She promised herself she'd think it over, but Randy's persistence made it difficult to refuse outright. "I'll look into it," she finally said, forcing a smile. Randy's grin was as wide as it was fleeting. "That's my girl," he said, leaning across the table to kiss her forehead. As Cindy cleared the dishes that evening, a sense of foreboding crept in, heavy and unshakable. The illusion of a perfect romance had begun to crack, but Cindy wasn't ready to see the pieces fall apart. Not yet. Cindy stood in the kitchen, her hands trembling slightly as she rinsed the last dish from dinner. Randy's voice echoed faintly from the living room, where he was watching TV, the low hum of the program doing little to calm her nerves. The folder labeled Janice haunted her thoughts like a specter she couldn't shake. She hadn't mentioned it again, and Randy had made no effort to explain, yet his insistence on life insurance lingered in the air like an unwelcome guest. The next morning, Randy seemed particularly attentive. He brought her coffee in bed, a gesture that would have felt loving if not for the weight of her growing doubts. I was thinking, he began, his voice casual yet deliberate. What if we planned a little getaway, something special for just us? Cindy blinked, surprised by the suggestion. A getaway? Yeah, to clear our heads. It's been a busy few months, hasn't it? His tone was light, but Cindy couldn't help but sense an underlying urgency. Before she could respond, her phone buzzed with a message from Lisa. Can we talk later? I've been thinking about what you said. Cindy stared at the screen for a moment too long, and Randy noticed. Everything okay? Yeah, she replied quickly, locking the phone and forcing a smile. Just Lisa checking in. He nodded but didn't press further. Still, Cindy felt his eyes linger on her for a moment longer than necessary. Later that evening, Lisa arrived unannounced, her expression tight with concern. Cindy, I can't shake this feeling, she said as they sat on the porch, the twilight casting long shadows over the yard. I've been doing some research, and I found something about Randy's first wife. Cindy's chest tightened. Lisa, I don't think... Please, just hear me out, Lisa interrupted, her voice urgent. Janice didn't just fall. There were people who thought it didn't make sense. The way she died, the timing of the insurance payout, it all felt too convenient. Cindy shook her head, though the unease in her gut grew stronger. Randy said it was an accident. He loved her. Did he? Lisa pressed. Or did he love what she left behind? The words hit harder than Cindy expected. She looked away, tears pricking the corners of her eyes. You don't know him like I do, Lisa sighed, her frustration evident. No, Cindy, I don't. But I do know when something doesn't feel right. And this, she gestured broadly, her voice faltering. This feels wrong. Cindy said nothing, her mind racing. When Lisa left, she sat alone for what felt like hours, replaying their conversation. She wanted to believe Randy, to trust the man who had swept her off her feet. But the cracks in her faith were growing wider. The next day, Randy suggested they go out for dinner at a small, quiet restaurant on the edge of town. Cindy agreed, hoping to push aside her worries for just one evening. Over a candlelit table, he reached for her hand, his expression warm and sincere. I know things have been a little stressful, he began. I just want you to know how much I care about you, about us. Cindy hesitated before nodding. I know, she said softly, though the words felt hollow. As the waiter approached with their check, Randy leaned in, his tone casual but pointed. By the way, I talked to the insurance agent today. He said everything's ready whenever you're comfortable signing. Cindy froze, her stomach knotting. You already talked to him? Just to get the details sorted, Randy said quickly, as if sensing her discomfort. It's no rush, of course. She forced a smile, her heart pounding. The walls felt as though they were closing in, the flicker of the candlelight casting ominous shadows across Randy's face. When they returned home, Cindy excused herself to the bathroom, where she sat on the edge of the tub, her thoughts spiraling. The whispers of doubt had become a deafening roar. She couldn't ignore them any longer. Later that night, while Randy slept soundly beside her, Cindy unlocked her phone and began typing a search. Randy Roth, Death Beacon Rock. The results flooded in, confirming what Lisa had said. The official report called it an accident, but the articles hinted at lingering suspicions. Cindy's breath caught as she read one line. The incident raised questions about her husband's involvement, though no charges were ever filed. Her fingers hovered over the screen, trembling. Her instincts screamed to confront Randy, but fear rooted her in place. What if Lisa was right? What if Randy wasn't the man she thought he was? As Cindy closed her eyes that night, sleep didn't come. The man beside her, the one she had trusted with her heart, now felt like a stranger, and the darkness between them only grew deeper. The morning sun danced on the surface of Lake Sammamish, its gentle ripples glinting like diamonds under a clear blue sky. Randy had insisted this outing would be a fresh start for them, a day to relax, to escape from the unease that had clouded their home. Cindy sat quietly in the passenger seat as Randy drove, his cheerful chatter filling the space. She forced herself to smile, nodding at his jokes, but her mind was elsewhere. The search results she'd read the night before echoed in her thoughts like a warning she couldn't silence. When they arrived at the lake, Randy unloaded the picnic basket and an inflatable raft, his enthusiasm almost too bright. "This'll be fun," he exclaimed, glancing at Cindy as she hesitated near the car. "Come on, you'll feel better once we're out there." Cindy nodded weakly, trailing behind him toward the water. As they settled near the shore, Randy inflated the raft with mechanical efficiency, chatting about everything and nothing. Cindy noticed how he avoided eye contact, his voice oddly rehearsed. The unease she'd carried all morning deepened, gnawing at her like a predator stalking its prey. "I'll stay on the raft," Randy announced, patting the bright yellow surface. "You should swim a little. It'll be refreshing." Cindy glanced at the water, her stomach churning. "I'm not sure I want to go in today," she said softly. Randy's expression didn't change, but his voice took on a sharper edge. "Come on, Cindy, it's a perfect day. Don't let this go to waste." A couple nearby watched as Cindy reluctantly waded into the water, her movements slow and deliberate. Randy floated a few feet away, his gaze fixed on her. The water was cold, sending a chill through her body that seemed to spread to her very core. As she moved farther from the shore, the depth below her became unsettling, the lake's murky depths swallowing her reflection. Minutes passed, and Cindy tried to steady her breathing. She felt Randy's eyes on her, an intensity that made her heart race for reasons she couldn't quite explain. "I think I'm done," she called out, turning toward him. "Just a little longer," Randy replied, his tone unnervingly calm. "You're doing great." Cindy hesitated, then nodded, kicking lightly to stay afloat. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, terribly wrong. Suddenly, her legs felt heavy, as if weighed down by an unseen force. She gasped, her arms flailing as she tried to tread water. "Randy!" she shouted, panic creeping into her voice. "Something's wrong!" Randy remained on the raft, watching her struggle. He made no move to dive in, his expression unreadable. Nearby, a fisherman glanced up, alarmed by the commotion. Cindy's cries grew desperate, her movements frantic as the water closed in around her. "Help me!" she screamed, her voice cracking with fear. The fisherman stood, his boat rocking as he tried to get a better view. "Hey! She's in trouble!" he shouted, waving his arms. Randy turned slightly, his lips curling into what could almost be described as a smirk before he sprang into action. Too late, far too late. By the time Randy reached Cindy, her body had gone still, her lifeless form floating just beneath the surface. The fisherman rowed closer, his heart pounding as Randy pulled her onto the raft with a mechanical detachment that sent chills down his spine. "She just went under," Randy said, his voice hollow, as if reciting lines from a poorly rehearsed play. The fisherman stared, his gut screaming that something wasn't right. Randy's face betrayed no emotion, no panic, no grief. It was as if he were performing for an unseen audience, each movement calculated. Emergency responders arrived quickly, their shouts breaking the eerie stillness. Randy's account of what had happened was simple, almost dismissive. "She was swimming. Then she started struggling. I tried to help, but it was too late." But the responders weren't the only ones listening. The fisherman stood nearby, his arms crossed, his eyes narrowing as he watched Randy's calm demeanor. Something gnawed at him, a quiet voice whispering that this was no accident. As Cindy's body was carried away, Randy approached the lead paramedic. "Do you know how soon I can get a copy of the report?" he asked, his tone disturbingly casual. The paramedic frowned, glancing at him. "You might want to take some time first," he replied, his voice tinged with unease. Randy nodded, stepping away. His face betrayed nothing, but his mind was already calculating. Cindy's death was just another chapter in his carefully crafted story, a tragedy he had orchestrated with chilling precision. Detective Karen Mitchell stood in the hallway of the station, flipping through the initial report from Lake Sammamish. The drowning itself seemed straightforward, but something gnawed at her. Witness statements painted a picture of calm, even disinterest, from Randy Roth. Karen had seen grief before, raw, unfiltered, chaotic. But Randy's reaction? It didn't fit. He had been too composed, too efficient. The first thread began to unravel when she interviewed Mark Preston, the fisherman who had witnessed Cindy's final moments. Mark sat across from her, his hands clasped tightly, his gaze steady but troubled. "He didn't look panicked," Mark said, his voice low but resolute. "I mean, if that were my wife out there, I wouldn't just sit and watch." Karen leaned forward, her pen poised. "You're saying he didn't try to save her right away?" Mark nodded. "That's exactly what I'm saying. It was like he was waiting for something." Karen jotted down the words, her pulse quickening. Waiting for what? The autopsy results arrived the next day, and Karen's instincts sharpened further. Cindy's lungs confirmed drowning, but bruises on her arms and torso raised questions. The bruises were consistent with blunt force, unusual for a simple drowning. Dr. Patel, the medical examiner, delivered the findings with careful precision. "Detective, these marks aren't conclusive evidence of foul play," Dr. Patel cautioned. "But they are odd." especially given the circumstances. Karen studied the photos, her mind racing. Cindy's death was starting to look less like an accident and more like the product of deliberate actions. Randy, however, remained calm and cooperative. When Karen called him in for a preliminary interview, he arrived on time, dressed immaculately, his demeanor cordial. "I'm happy to help however I can," Randy said, folding his hands neatly on the table. "I've already told the responders everything I know." Karen nodded, keeping her expression neutral. "Walk me through it again," she said, "from the moment you arrived at the lake." Randy recounted the day with precision, his voice steady and unwavering. But when Karen asked about the bruises on Cindy's body, a flicker of annoyance crossed his face. "She must have hit something," he replied quickly. "Maybe a rock. The water was deeper than it looked." Karen pressed further. "Mr. Roth, you mentioned trying to help her. Did you grab her arms or—" "I told you," Randy interrupted, his tone sharpening. "I tried, but she went under too fast." Karen let the silence hang in the air, watching him closely. His words were polished, but his body language betrayed flashes of tension. A tap of his finger, a glance at the clock. The investigation deepened when Cindy's sister Julie came forward. Julie's face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed as she sat in Karen's office. "Cindy wasn't herself these past few months," Julie began, her voice trembling. "She told me she was scared of him." Karen's pen stilled mid-sentence. "Scared? Did she say why?" Julie hesitated, tears spilling down her cheeks. "She didn't want to talk about it much. Just little things, how controlling he was, how he kept pushing her to sign that insurance policy. She didn't trust him." Karen felt a jolt of recognition. The life insurance policy, an uncomfortable thread tying everything together. She requested the documents and discovered that the policy had been updated mere weeks before Cindy's death, listing Randy as the sole beneficiary. As the pieces began to form a grim mosaic, Karen revisited Randy's file. Something about his history didn't sit right. A quick database search turned up an old case file from 1981, the death of his first wife, Janice Roth. The report described a tragic fall during a hike at Beacon Rock, a case ruled accidental at the time. But Karen saw the same eerie pattern, a life insurance payout just weeks after the marriage. Her heart pounded as she made the connection. 2 wives, 2 tragic accidents, and Randy Roth at the center of both. She stared at her notes. The word pattern circled repeatedly. This wasn't coincidence. This was something darker. Karen exhaled slowly, her resolve hardening. The cracks in Randy's story were growing wider, and she was determined to see what lay beneath. Detective Karen Mitchell sat at her desk, staring at the 2 case files in front of her. The similarities between Cindy's drowning and Janice Roth's fall at Beacon Rock were impossible to ignore. Both incidents involved tragic, untimely deaths. Both wives had substantial life insurance policies taken out shortly before their deaths, with Randy Roth as the sole beneficiary. The pattern was there, staring her in the face, but proving it would require more than just gut instinct. She began by contacting the lead investigator from Janice Roth's 1981 case, now retired. Harold McLean's voice on the other end of the phone was gravelly but sharp. "Beacon Rock," he muttered. "I remember it. Young woman, newly married, falls to her death. Husband claimed she lost her footing." Karen leaned forward. "Do you remember anything unusual about the case?" There was a pause before Harold replied. "Roth was odd, too composed for a man who just lost his wife. But there wasn't much we could do. No witnesses, no solid evidence, just his word and the payout." Karen thanked him and hung up, frustration gnawing at her. She needed more. Digging deeper, she tracked down Janice's sister, Linda Porter. When Linda agreed to meet, Karen immediately sensed the woman's lingering pain as they sat across from each other in a quiet diner. "Janice loved Randy," Linda began, her voice trembling. "She thought he was her future, but there were things she never talked about, things I should have pressed her on." Karen nodded, encouraging her to continue. "What kind of things?" Linda hesitated, tears brimming in her eyes. "A few months before the accident, she called me upset. She said Randy had been pressuring her to take out a life insurance policy. I told her it was strange, but she brushed it off, said he was just being cautious." Karen's pen flew across her notebook. "Did she ever express any fear of him?" Linda's gaze dropped to the table. "Not directly, but she wasn't herself toward the end. She seemed smaller, like she was carrying something she couldn't say out loud." The pain in Linda's voice was palpable, and Karen's resolve hardened. She requested the case file from Janice's death and compared it to Cindy's. The similarities were striking, not just in the circumstances, but in Randy's behavior. In both cases, he had remained eerily calm, cooperative to a fault, yet emotionally distant. His meticulous planning had shielded him once. Karen vowed it wouldn't happen again. The breakthrough came when Karen discovered an old financial statement buried in Randy's 1981 records. Among the expenses listed was a luxury vacation taken weeks after Janice's death, paid for with the insurance money. The image of a grieving husband unraveled further as Karen pieced together Randy's pattern of calculated exploitation. Meanwhile, the pressure mounted as Cindy's family pushed for answers. Julie, Cindy's sister, returned to Karen's office with an envelope of old photos. "I found these in her house," Julie said, her voice tight. "Look at her eyes in these last pictures. She wasn't happy. She knew something wasn't right." Karen studied the photos, her heart sinking. Cindy's forced smiles betrayed the truth she'd kept hidden. It was a silent plea that Karen couldn't ignore. The investigation hit another chilling turn when Karen received a call from Randy's former co-worker, Tom Harrington. "You're looking into Roth?" Tom said, his voice tinged with unease. "I worked with him years ago. The guy was, let's just say, he knew how to cover his tracks." Karen pressed for more details, and Tom revealed that Randy had often joked about the benefits of tragedy. He'd dismissed it as dark humor at the time, but now it felt sinister. As Karen pieced the puzzle together, the weight of the case became suffocating. Randy Roth wasn't just a man with bad luck. He was a predator, someone who manipulated trust and emotion to serve his greed. But the evidence, while compelling, was circumstantial. She needed more to bring him down. Karen leaned back in her chair, staring at the growing stack of files. 2 women had already fallen victim to Randy's schemes. She wouldn't let there be a third. Detective Karen Mitchell sat across from Randy Roth in the sterile interrogation room, her notepad resting on the table between them. Randy looked as calm as ever, his polished demeanor unshaken. He leaned back in his chair, hands folded, the faintest hint of a smile playing on his lips. It was as if he thought this was just another formal procedure, one he would effortlessly navigate. Karen's tone was steady but firm as she began. "Randy, I appreciate you coming in today. I just have a few follow-up questions regarding Cindy's passing. You understand how important it is to clarify every detail." Randy nodded, his expression unreadable. "Of course. Anything I can do to help." Karen leaned forward slightly. "Let's go back to the lake for a moment. Witnesses describe you staying on the raft while Cindy struggled. One even mentioned that you didn't react immediately. Can you explain that?" Randy's lips twitched, his voice smooth. "It all happened so fast. One second she was fine, the next she was gone. I did what I could." Karen's eyes didn't waver. "Did you?" "The autopsy indicates bruising on her arms and torso, injuries that don't align with an accidental drowning. Do you have any idea how those might have occurred?" Randy's smile faded slightly, but he didn't flinch. "I wasn't close enough to notice anything like that. Maybe she hit a rock or—" Karen interrupted, her voice sharper. "Randy, you were close enough to notice when she went under, close enough to pull her onto the raft after the fact. These bruises suggest something happened before she entered the water." Randy's composure cracked for the briefest moment, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face before he recovered. "Detective, I loved Cindy. I would never hurt her. These questions, they're starting to feel like an accusation." Karen didn't blink. "I'm not accusing, Randy, I'm clarifying." She let the silence stretch, watching as Randy's fingers began to drum softly against the table. It was the first time she'd seen him fidget. She pressed on, shifting the conversation. "There's another thing I'd like to discuss," Karen said, her tone measured. "Your first wife, Janice. Her death was ruled an accident, but there are some inconsistencies. Witnesses recall you behaving similarly calm afterward, just like you were with Cindy." Randy's jaw tightened, his voice dropping slightly. "That's ancient history. It has nothing to do with this." Karen opened a file and slid a photo of Janice across the table. 2 wives, 2 accidents, both with sizable life insurance payouts going directly to you. Randy's gaze darted to the photo, then back to Karen. For the first time, his polished exterior began to fray. "I've already told you everything," he said, his tone clipped. This is ridiculous." Karen didn't let up. "Ridiculous or coincidental? Because I don't believe in coincidences like this, Randy, and neither will a jury." The door to the room opened suddenly, and Officer Jim Daniels stepped in, nodding to Karen. "Detective, we've got something," he said, his voice grave. Karen excused herself, leaving Randy alone under the sterile lights. Outside the room, Daniels handed her a folder. Financial records just came in. He was draining Cindy's accounts weeks before she died. And get this, he's already made inquiries about filing the life insurance claim. Karen's grip on the folder tightened. We've got him. She re-entered the room with a renewed sense of purpose. Randy's composure was starting to crack, his mask slipping as she laid the folder in front of him. These are your financial records, Randy. Care to explain why you were accessing Cindy's account so frequently before her death? Randy's silence was deafening. The predator who had so carefully constructed his image was finally exposed, his calculated facade crumbling under the weight of evidence. Karen leaned forward, her voice low but unyielding. You've had years to perfect your story, but it's over, Randy. We know who you are, and this time you won't walk away. The courtroom buzzed with subdued chatter as Randy Roth entered, his expression carefully neutral. He wore a tailored suit, his posture confident, as though this were another business meeting. The room quieted when the bailiff called the court to order, and all eyes turned to the defendant, a man accused of manipulating love, trust, and tragedy for personal gain. Cindy's family sat in the first row, their grief palpable. Julie clutched a photo of her sister, her knuckles white against the frame. The prosecutor, Alex Grant, stood and delivered his opening statement with unflinching precision. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Alex began, his voice firm. This case is not about coincidence. It's about a man who viewed marriage as a transaction, wives as investments, and their deaths as opportunities. Randy Roth didn't just fail to save Cindy. He orchestrated her death. Randy's attorney, Daniel Moore, countered with an air of practiced empathy. This is a tragic accident, nothing more. Mr. Roth is a grieving husband, unfairly accused because grief doesn't always look the way we expect. The trial unfolded methodically. Witnesses took the stand, each piece of testimony chipping away at Randy's polished exterior. Mark Preston, the fisherman who had seen Cindy's final moments, recounted what he'd observed. He wasn't panicked, Mark testified, his voice steady but laced with unease. She was calling for help and he just sat there. It didn't feel right. Daniel Moore cross-examined sharply. Mr. Preston, could it be that you misinterpreted his reaction? Grief affects everyone differently. Mark frowned. Grief doesn't make you wait to save someone drowning. The prosecution's next witness was Cindy's sister, Julie, who spoke through tears. Cindy told me she was scared of him, Julie said, her voice trembling. She said he was pressuring her to sign things, but she didn't want to. She didn't trust him. When Randy took the stand, he maintained his calm facade, speaking with measured tones. I loved Cindy, he said, meeting the jury's gaze. Her death devastated me. These accusations, they're not just wrong, they're cruel. Alex Grant wasted no time dismantling Randy's narrative. You loved her? Then explain why you accessed her bank accounts weeks before her death. Explain why you inquired about the life insurance claim the same day she drowned. Randy hesitated, the first crack in his composure. I was trying to handle the financial chaos, he said quickly. It's what Cindy would have wanted. Alex leaned closer. Cindy would have wanted you to vacation in Hawaii just weeks after her funeral, because that's where the money went, isn't it? The tension in the room was suffocating. Randy's attorney objected, but the damage was done. The jury's expressions hardened as Alex methodically presented evidence of Randy's financial transactions, his history with Janice, and his chilling pattern of control. The final blow came with the testimony of a forensic expert who detailed the bruises on Cindy's arms. These injuries suggest restraint, the expert concluded. They are inconsistent with an accidental drowning. Randy's mask slipped further as the expert's words hung in the air. He clenched his jaw, his fingers gripping the edge of the table. For the first time, his carefully constructed image of innocence began to crumble under the weight of the truth. The courtroom fell silent as Alex Grant delivered his closing argument. Randy Roth saw Cindy not as a partner, but as a payout. He manipulated her trust, isolated her from those who could help, and ultimately ensured her death when she became inconvenient. This was no accident. This was murder. The jury deliberated for hours that felt like days. Cindy's family waited anxiously, their pain etched into every line of their faces. When the foreperson finally stood to deliver the verdict, the room was so quiet that a pin drop would have echoed. On the charge of first-degree murder, the foreperson began, we find the defendant guilty. Julie sobbed quietly, her tears a mixture of relief and heartbreak. Randy's expression hardened, his calm demeanor replaced by a flicker of anger. As the bailiff escorted him out, He glanced back at the courtroom, his eyes cold, unrepentant. Justice had been served, but the scars left behind would never fully heal. The air in the courtroom was thick with anticipation as everyone awaited the jury's return. Cindy's family sat huddled together, their faces etched with equal parts hope and dread. Julie clutched a handkerchief tightly, her knuckles white against the fabric. She had spent the trial reliving every painful detail of her sister's final months, and now the weight of justice, or its absence, hung in the balance. Randy Roth sat stoically at the defense table, his expression unreadable. His attorney, Daniel Moore, whispered something in his ear, but Randy didn't respond. His gaze was fixed on the jury door, his jaw tight, his hands folded neatly on the table. To the casual observer, he might have appeared calm, but to those who had watched him throughout the trial, the subtle twitch of his fingers betrayed a growing tension. The door creaked open and the jury filed in. 12 faces, carefully neutral, avoided meeting anyone's eyes. The courtroom fell silent, the kind of silence that seemed to stretch endlessly. The judge looked toward the foreperson, a middle-aged woman with a grave expression. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" the judge asked, his tone steady but weighted. "We have, Your Honor," the foreperson replied, her voice firm. Julie's grip on the handkerchief tightened further as the foreperson unfolded the piece of paper in her hand. Each word seemed to come slower than the last, as if time itself were holding its breath. "On the charge of first-degree murder, we find the defendant guilty." A collective exhale swept through the courtroom, followed by a muffled sob from Cindy's family. Julie leaned into her mother, tears streaming down her face. The relief was overwhelming, a bittersweet vindication for the pain they had endured. Justice, though long awaited, could never bring Cindy back, but it could ensure Randy would never harm another. Randy's reaction was chilling. His face remained impassive, his body unnervingly still, but his eyes burned with a cold, unyielding defiance. For the first time, the mask of calm he had worn throughout the trial seemed to falter, revealing something darker beneath. "Mr. Roth," the judge addressed him, his voice cutting through the emotional undercurrent of the room, "you have been found guilty by a jury of your peers. Your actions have brought unimaginable pain to the lives of those you claim to love. You are hereby sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole." The gavel struck, its echo reverberating through the chamber. The courtroom erupted into a flurry of movement as spectators whispered, reporters scrambled for statements, and Randy was led away in handcuffs. Julie watched him go, her expression a mixture of triumph and sorrow. Outside the courthouse, the media swarmed. Cameras flashed, microphones extended toward Cindy's family as they made their way to the steps. Alex Grant, the prosecutor, spoke briefly, his tone resolute. "Today's verdict is a testament to the perseverance of law enforcement, the bravery of witnesses, and the unwavering love of Cindy's family," he said. "While we cannot undo the harm caused by Randy Roth, we can ensure that he is held accountable." Julie stepped forward, her voice trembling but strong. Cindy was more than a victim. She was a mother, a sister, a friend. She deserved so much more than what Randy gave her. We hope her story reminds others to trust their instincts and to speak up when something feels wrong. Later that evening, Julie sat alone in her living room, the quiet stark in contrast to the chaos of the trial. She held the same photo of Cindy that she had clutched throughout the proceedings. In it, Cindy's smile was bright, her eyes full of life. Julie traced the edges of the frame with her fingers, her tears falling silently. Justice had been served, but the void left by Cindy's absence was immeasurable. Randy was gone, stripped of his power, his schemes exposed, but the scars he had left would linger for years to come, a haunting reminder of the depths of his deception. Julie whispered into the stillness a promise to her sister. "You deserve better, and I'll make sure no one forgets that." Months after the verdict, the courthouse steps were quieter, the media frenzy fading into memory. For Cindy's family, however, the impact of her death lingered like a deep scar. Julie found herself in the spotlight as an unwilling advocate for awareness, speaking at events and giving interviews about recognizing warning signs in toxic relationships. One such event took place at a local community center, where Julie addressed a room of women. She held Cindy's photo, her hands steady despite the emotion welling in her chest. "Cindy was vibrant, caring, and full of life," Julie began, her voice steady but laden with sadness. "She trusted the wrong person, a man who used her love and trust as tools for his own gain. But her story doesn't end with tragedy. It's a call to action for all of us. As Julie spoke, Detective Karen Mitchell listened from the back of the room, nodding in agreement. Karen had spent months piecing together the puzzle of Randy Roth's actions, yet the case continued to haunt her. It wasn't just about Cindy or Janice. It was about a system that had allowed a predator to thrive for so long. After the event, Karen approached Julie, her expression somber. "You're doing important work," Karen said quietly, "but I can't help feeling we missed something earlier, something that could have saved her." Julie shook her head. "You did everything you could. Randy was calculated, manipulative. He fooled us all." Karen paused, then reached into her bag, pulling out a small, weathered journal. "We found this in Cindy's belongings," she said, handing it to Julie. "I thought you should have it." Julie opened the journal with trembling hands, recognizing her sister's handwriting immediately. The entry started lighthearted, filled with Cindy's hopes for her future with Randy. But as the pages progressed, the tone darkened. One entry stood out, written just weeks before her death. "Something doesn't feel right. Randy keeps pushing for the insurance papers. I can't shake this feeling that I've made a mistake. I wish I could talk to someone, but he always knows." Julie's breath caught as she read the words. Tears blurred her vision, but a sense of resolve grew within her. Cindy had been trapped by fear and isolation, but her voice would now serve as a warning to others. Karen placed a hand on Julie's shoulder. "Her words will help people see what she couldn't. That's how we stop this from happening again." In the months that followed, changes began to take shape. Advocacy groups pushed for stricter regulations on life insurance policies, requiring more thorough investigations into large payouts involving spouses. The case of Randy Roth became a key example in seminars for law enforcement, teaching officers to recognize patterns of manipulation and control in domestic crimes. Despite the progress, the personal pain remained. Julie often found herself replaying memories of Cindy's laughter, her warm presence filling the room. Those moments were bittersweet now, a reminder of what had been stolen. On a quiet evening, Julie visited Cindy's grave, kneeling beside the headstone. She placed a bouquet of fresh lilies on the ground, her voice barely above a whisper. "You were so much more than what he did to you," she said, her tears falling freely. "I promise, Cindy, I'll make sure no one ever forgets." As Julie stood, the evening sky began to darken, casting long shadows over the cemetery. Yet amidst the quiet, there was a sense of peace. Cindy's story, though tragic, had sparked change. Her voice, through her journal, through Julie, through the trial, was finally being heard. And as Julie walked away, the words of Detective Karen echoed in her mind. Her story doesn't end with tragedy. It ends with purpose.